Welcome to this episode of PwC Startup Perspectives. ESG, as you all know, is becoming the new normal, and investors are using that as a leverage to create value in their organizations or the organizations they are investing in. They're driving the change and they are baking it into their investment decisions and also nudging their portfolio companies into undertaking the transformation journey. Now, how this is getting played out in an Indian ecosystem? We have with us Kanwaljit Singh, managing partner from Fireside Ventures, who has significant experience in this playouts to share his experience. Welcome, Kanwal, to the show. In this evolving landscape, we see investors as the primary change agent driving this agenda. We also see them becoming UNPRI signatories and baking it into their investment decisions and even engaging with their portfolio companies, pushing them ahead. You have been an early adopter of this in your early stage startup ecosystem. What has been your experience?
Yeah, thanks for having me on this discussion. To answer your question, we look at the whole space of ESG as a very integral part of the journey of a startup. And our role as enablers who can help them understand the imperatives around ESG and how we can provide them with support around the ecosystem in making some of these policies more part of their everyday operations and the way they run their businesses. So just to elaborate a little bit, the starting point for us is when we are evaluating a company, we start putting a lens of ESG very early on. So the idea of what kind of policies, are they compliant on certain regulatory requirements, what kind of governance norms they have, what are their own internal drivers towards looking at areas of environment, sustainability, etc. Now, you can appreciate that for a startup, a young company, a lot of this may not be in place. But if we find that both the fundamentals are either in place or intention to put them in place is strong, and they are aligned on our vision of how we are seeing the role of ESG in the growth of their business, that's really important to us. And then what we do is once we have invested in a company, we play a dual role. One is, of course, a governance role at the board, where we not only assess and evaluate and continuously try to understand how they are complying on some of these requirements, but also a supportive role of helping them as they build the business on their journey towards more and more ESG integration into the business.
Thanks, Kanwal, for the sharing your experience. But as we speak to startups, what are the typical concerns that they have when they want to adopt ESG into their operations or supply chains? Is it seen as something which increases the cost? Or do you have any alternate method of evaluating technologies or raising sustainable finance which can reduce the impact of the cost on their operations and supply chains?
So classically in the consumer brand space, the biggest area of focus for any company is always about the cost of goods, the gross margins, and very often the solutions that are available, whether you talk about plastic neutrality, whether you talk about substitution of products which are environmentally unfriendly, typically end up with a higher cost possibility around them. And that is really what a lot of the startups are most concerned about. Second is obviously as they focus on building out the organization and they are sensitive about inclusivity, about diversity, but very often the pace of building the business, they are really looking for getting the right person for the right job. So some of these aspects don't become so top of mind for them. So the balancing act here is how do we provide both solutions which can be economically and financially viable. And that's where, like you asked, the role of technology and financing can play a significant part in that. Technology today is enabling a lot of very interesting possibilities, especially we have seen working with larger consumer companies like Unilever and L'Oreal and Nestle and so on and so forth. So can we provide access to these companies in making some of these technology solutions accessible to them? On the financing piece, interestingly, we believe there are lots of organizations, both within India and globally, who are willing to provide financing opportunities at very attractive, rates of interest to companies who are willing to go down a certain path of ESG compliance, which may require them to make some system changes, and therefore there is a cost attached to that. So it's really about creating awareness. It's about providing frameworks which these startups are able to imbibe. I must say the most interesting and a very positive learning for us as we have started, down this journey of ESG for our portfolio companies has been the extreme consciousness and desire to make it happen. So it's not just that somebody is enforcing it or there is a regulatory pressure and you have to do it for the sake of just checking a box. A lot of these new age founders are very both interested and extremely conscientious about wanting to do things. And there are lots and lots of examples where companies like Mama Earth and Badam Teas and Slurp Farms, we have seen them do things way ahead of what is the regulatory framework requirements, just because they believe both in the cause of what they are doing and how it can impact both the people and the planet and not just their own businesses.
Understood, Kanwal. But do you think there is a need for collective action on this? Because sometimes being a pioneer might be quite challenging. So what has been that experience, and how can collectively the ecosystem can converge together to drive adoption and to create value?
So, this is almost like, a most important learning that we have understood very early on, and certainly must admit that some of the learning and the guidance came from PwC, since we have been working with you guys from the beginning of this journey, is that this is not going to be a single company or a single player of the ecosystem to solve for. And it is truly a case of 2 and 2 making, not even 22, maybe something much larger. So the role that the ecosystem plays, the collective, as you called it, is extremely critical in how we can make this a movement. And our belief is that if we can get stakeholders like startups, stakeholders like companies like yourself who are consulting these companies in the startup system, we can have players who are providing solutions to these startups. The role of the government, the role of the financing bodies, and how can that collective provide such a strong framework within which it becomes more of a plug and play for any new company which is starting out. There is a well-defined path of what do you do at each stage of your evolution. So I think that's really the vision that we have. In fact, we are working on a concept that we call value of good, and this is really targeted towards driving collective action, where we have been already in conversations with some of the larger consumer companies, with people like yourself, with even some government bodies, some ecosystem players who are providing solutions, especially in areas like plastic neutrality, more inclusivity of the workforce. And we hope that, if this momentum and the movement, as I called it, can take a life of its own, then it just becomes a very virtuous cycle.
Yeah, I can understand, Kanwal. But I just had one more query on this. You have been a pioneer in embedding some of these elements in early stage startups, right? But as these startups gain scale, at each stage, it would require a different level of intervention or technology or financing. How has that been? And where have you intervened? What has been your experience, if you can share some of that?
So, the interesting learning, and we are also, discovering this as we go along. So it's like a continuum and a journey for all of us. But what we have seen is that there are some very distinct stages as the business starts evolving. right from the get-go, when there is a concept and they are trying to create a solution around it, at that point a company starts thinking about what is this solution going to help my consumer. I think the question that more and more companies need to ask, and the good news is a lot of them are asking, is not just what is this going to do as good to the consumer, but what is this going to do good to the rest of the world, to the planet, to the people which live on the planet. And very often the two almost become convergent. Now, obviously, when the company gets into actual, product and market, they start engaging with the consumers, then more and more they are focused on areas of just getting the governance right, areas of making sure that they are regulatorily compliant. So there are some basic baby steps that they need to make just to start on this journey of ESG. As they grow bigger, as they start getting more consumer acceptance, as they start becoming a brand, I think that's when they start thinking about, okay, how can I make myself more relevant to this consumer's life and make it a more impactful story for the larger good of the community and the planet. And that's where our intervention becomes most valuable. So if they are in a business, let's say a personal care business where you are using single-use plastic for all your packaging, can you start using different materials? Can you start making efforts to become more plastic neutral or carbon neutral? How do you build that sensitivity into your business system? And that's when we talked about the cost and some of the aspects which are involved. The second thing that is happening more and more is that the consciousness of the organizational design again is happening. More and more progressive companies are starting to recognize that. And we are very, very excited about the fact that at Fireside 50% of our founders are women. And that's a great sign of both entrepreneurial activity and how we are seeing the kind of evolution of this more inclusive, more diverse entrepreneurial ecosystem. But even in the terms of hiring the people, even in terms of putting in policies, in making them more friendly towards, for example, women who may have other constraints in terms of their work-life balance, or hiring people who come from differently able backgrounds. I think that's the stage at which we are seeing a lot of both interest and innovation happening in the stage of establishing the business foundations. Once the company has reached a certain size, say 100 crores in revenue, that's when they start actually becoming much more institutional about it. So the policies get defined, they start putting in frameworks, they start defining how they are going to interpret and engage on the ESG front.
Thanks a lot, Kanwal, for bringing to life the ESG philosophy that you have been adopting as you started your investment journey and nudging your portfolio companies. What I also liked is that at each stage of the growth, there are possibilities of intervening and there is a possibility of creating long-term value. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Hopefully, you were enriched by the insights of Kanwal. Look forward to the next session.